Where now the horse and the rider? Where is the horn that was blowing? Where is the helm and the hauberk, and the bright hair flowing? Where is the hand on the harp-string, and the red fire glowing? Where is the spring and the harvest, and the tall corn growing? They have passed like rain on the mountain, like a wind in the meadow. The days have gone down in the west, behind the hills, into shadow. Who shall gather the smoke of the dead wood burning, or behold the flowing years from the sea returning? I'm surprised how many times that the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor of December 1941 was depicted on screen. I thought it was like one of those things that Americans don't really like to talk about, and making a movie about the attack is kind of considered tasteless. I noticed that when Lindsay Ellis did her coverage about the incident in New York in 2001, I would say the actual name, but YouTube monetization bots are weird and they will demonetize anything that has to do with that situation, even if you're just talking about it matter-of-factly. Movies that featured the event as part of their film, or a plot device, or made it the central focus, were quick to be lambasted. So I assume the same was applicable with Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor has been reincarnated on screen several times, some of which were actually made during World War II. Throughout the past 8 decades, as filming techniques and effects have gotten more advanced, and no one seems to get tired of World War II movies, more versions have popped up. I must admit right away that this was one of the toughest ranking lists I had to make in the past year that I've spent on YouTube. It is an entirely different experience comparing different versions of an event than different versions of one individual. I said last time that I'm ranking each version from worst to best, but that was before I had to start comparing all of them. I was so naive, because some of these are good, or they're attached to really good movies or TV series, but they use the actual attack as an afterthought that only lasts a few minutes. But then some may actually be about Pearl Harbor, but just not very good overall. As a result, most of these come down to personal preference, factoring in how the attack impacts the plot and what characters we're following, and historical accuracy, of course, followed by its entertainment value. And I have another confession. I did my best to attain as many of these depictions as possible, but try as I might, there were some I just simply couldn't find, and I apologise for that. Like, one was this TV show called Voyagers, which is about a boy and a man hopping through time together. I think that's what it's about. I don't know, I've never seen it, but every time I tried searching for that episode, my browser was just like, oh, did you mean Star Trek? No, I did not mean Star Trek. There was also this TV series called Pearl, which unfortunately was so obscure that the DVD cost more than £30, and that's about $40 in the United States. I simply do not have £30 to spend on one DVD that I'm going to use for one video and never touch again. Also, remember Pearl Harbor and Attack, which were movies that came out a year or two after the event as propaganda pieces, also could not be found, not even clips. This is a problem that arose with a lot of films that came out more than 50 years ago. Back then, it wasn't considered necessary to preserve films or TV shows, and some were destroyed deliberately because there wasn't enough storage space, or they decayed, or they were burned in fires, or they reused the film for other projects. This is the reason why a lot of old Doctor Who episodes from the William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton era went missing and had to be recreated with animation or as audio dramas. I am not covering the episode of The Waltons on this list either, because that focused on a family in Virginia reacting to the news, and I kind of want to focus on the events being carried out at the very place. So of the 11 I managed to gather here on this list today, let's take a look at which one covered the attack on Pearl Harbor to the best of their ability. Please be aware that the films and TV shows and video games, etc. that I'll be showing will have scenes of violence and explosions and people getting shot. None of the entries on this list go above a PG-13/12A level of rating, so there won't be any serious gore. There is the briefest glimpse of a clip of Alien as an example, but other than that there is some violence, but not graphic violence. Again, I must assert that just because this is at the bottom of the list, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. But their version of the attack was so quick that it just ended up here by default. You're right there, Alan. Do you want to perform a tap number while you're walking around with your long claws? I know you're not a big John Wayne fan, but we got to talk about the movie. In Harm's Way is a 1965 movie starring John Wayne and Kirk Douglas. It begins on the night before the attack, where the wife of an officer is getting around while her husband is absent from Pearl Harbor. Kind of a racy beginning, showing her and her boyfriend going to the beach, probably the same beach in From Here to Eternity. I know by this point that the Hays Code, which was on its way out, would officially be dropped in a few years' time, but I'm still surprised they got away with the woman just taking her dress off. I mean, yeah, she does get punished for it later because during the attack she and her boyfriend are killed in a fiery blaze, but I digress. When the attack begins, the focus is on two vessels. One is a destroyer in the harbour, which doesn't share a name with any of the actual destroyers that were there. With their captain absent, it is the lieutenant on board that takes command of the ship and sees their ship able to survive the attack. Elsewhere near Oahu, John Wayne and Kirk Douglas, I know their characters have names, but you're only going to remember them as John Wayne and Kirk Douglas, are commanding a cruiser that is just outside of Oahu when they see the attack on Pearl Harbor happen from a distance. They try to pursue the attackers as they flee, but only get the cruiser torpedoed by submarines for their efforts. The attack is placed at the beginning of the film to show the main characters disgrace themselves and later manage to be redeemed during battles in World War II. This was the case for a lot of officers who were there on that day who disregarded the warnings and were blamed for not being prepared enough. It's not bad, it's just not that remarkable when it comes to portraying the scale of the attack. Everyone knows this movie, don't they? It's not so much famous for showing the attack on Pearl Harbor as it is for the kissing scene on the beach between Deborah Kerr and Burt Lancaster that's been parodied again and again and again. While the previous entry had the attack happen at the beginning of the movie, this film has the attack happen towards the end. I hesitate spoiling a movie that's almost 70 years old, but I kind of need to explain the plot, so the context makes sense. Montgomery Clift plays a private who's been bullied for most of the film by his superior because he's a talented boxer that doesn't want to fight because he blinded a guy in his last match. He and his friend, who's played by Frank Sinatra, endure tough treatment until Frank Sinatra gets himself beaten to death by a guy who clearly was not a fan. Then Montgomery Clift kills the guy who beat Frank Sinatra to death. Meanwhile, the wife of the officer bullying Montgomery Clift and Frank Sinatra is having an affair with Burt Lancaster, who is the only good guy on the military base, it seems. And, of course, they do the kiss on the beach that's a very obvious metaphor.
Everybody got that? Good!
At this point in the narrative, Montgomery Clift is in hiding with a stab wound that he got while he was avenging Frank Sinatra, and Burt Lancaster has managed to get the bullying officer dismissed from the army for his horrible treatment. Things seem like they'll end nicely, and then the attack begins. It comes out of nowhere, which is justifiable as the majority of people who were there at the time were taken by surprise. The focus is on the soldiers, as they're the ones we've been following throughout the film, but they do include stock footage of the attack as well. Burt Lancaster's character has been adamant that he doesn't want to be an officer, which is a shame because he shows himself to be a capable leader as he leads a strike team from the roof of the barracks. Later, Montgomery Clift's character tries to rejoin his group, but he gets shot because of the heightened security that has arisen as a result of the attack. This once again has a good story attached to the attack on Pearl Harbor, but the actual event comes and goes so quickly. There's not much else to say about it, other than the book and the film have a lot of differences because the army kept intervening on the production to make sure that they didn't come off badly. It's still a good movie though.
But don't tell him what we know about the attack because it might frighten him. I'll get to you, Father. Anyway, I can run faster than you.
Promise?
I promise. Tony, you go with him. What about you?
He's going to save my father.
When I decided that time travel media would be allowed on these rankings, I kind of hoped that the first show to have the honour would be Doctor Who. I do wonder if the time tunnel was partially inspired by Doctor Who, as it came out only a few years after that show premiered. I can't confirm that because there aren't that many details about the pre-production of the series. The premise of the time tunnel is that the United States government have invested heavily on the top secret project TikTok, which disappointingly has nothing to do with viral dances or recording customer freakouts at McDonald's. In an underground laboratory, a team of scientists have created the titular time tunnel, where they hope to attain the secret of time travel. When Senator Leroy Clark threatens to shut down the project if he doesn't see results then and there, one of the lead scientists, Dr. Tony Newman, volunteers himself to be sent back. His colleague, and presumably his best friend, Dr. Doug Phillips, I might ship the two of them by the time we reach the Titanic rankings, goes after him. Back in the present, the scientists move them from one era to another when their lives are in danger, so Doug and Tony are just trying to stay alive while their colleagues try to get them home. I can't help comparing this show with Doctor Who, especially this episode, because this features one of the main characters meeting their father on the day that they died, much like Father's Day in the Revive series. Doug and Tony find themselves in the Japanese consulate in Honolulu and realise it's December 6, 1941, a date that means a lot to Tony because his father was a lieutenant commander who went MIA during the attack and his body was never found. Tony, who was 7 at the time, clearly never got over that and thinks if he warns his father he will survive. The thing with the time tunnel is that they don't have the luxury of having a Time Lord with them to say that the attack on Pearl Harbor is a fixed point in time and space and changing it will bring terrible consequences. Doug and Tony are new to time travel and they haven't figured out what the rules are yet. I haven't seen the full series yet, but so far this is the only episode that investigates the possibility of what happens when you meet your past self. Tony conveniently doesn't remember what he was doing on that day, only that his father died and that his friend's house was destroyed by getting caught in the crossfire. I've checked if civilian houses were destroyed as a result of the attack, and it turns out some of the anti-aircraft rounds from the Americans accidentally detonated in civilian areas in Honolulu, but they specify that the house is in the drop zone. So really the only logical way the house could deliberately get bombed by the Japanese would be if they were in the officers' quarters on Ford Island. But Tony and Doug are clearly able to go back and forth to the house and the Japanese consulate on foot in a matter of minutes. As a result, the show clearly demonised the Japanese by saying civilians were also targeted. It's an inaccuracy you might have been able to get away with in the 60s, but if it was made today, it would be torn apart by critics and historians alike. So back to the whole time travel thing. I interpreted that the reason Tony doesn't remember where he was on December 7th, 1941 is because when you meet your future self, your mind doesn't let you accept the paradox, so you forget. Again, if we're using Doctor Who logic here, when the Doctor meets one of his previous regenerations, that previous regeneration doesn't remember it, and sometimes it might age the previous regeneration. All of this has me wondering if young Tony's memory of that day is obscured because he was always meant to invent time travel and come back to this day. Is time a fixed progression of cause and effect in this universe and not a great big ball of wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff? Or am I just reading too much into a campy 60s time travel thing? I don't know why I just dedicated a whole tangent into working out the rules of time travel in this show, but if you're going to do a show about time travel, I'm going to get deep in thought over it. These were thoughts going through my mind while I was watching because the actual attack on Pearl Harbor is kind of a background thing. The conflict isn't can we stop the attack, there is no stopping the attack. The characters in the present have this very discussion where one of them considers the idea of preventing one of the most devastating attacks in history, and nothing sucks more than knowing something terrible is going to happen and you can't stop it with all the hindsight in the world. Another reason is because this moment in history defined America on the world stage for years afterwards. Project TikTok was about exploring time, not exploiting it. All this and I haven't even gotten into how the Japanese characters were portrayed in the show yet. Honestly, I'm kind of 50-50. Most of them are vilified, including the maid working for young Tony's friend's mum. The only one who isn't villainised, has no lines, and gets hastily murdered by the Japanese consulate's equivalent of Oddjob. On the other hand, you see how confident these guys are that the attack will win them the war, which was accurate, and absolutely refuse to believe when Tony and Doug tell them that the fate of the war won't be decided at Pearl Harbor, but at Hiroshima. To be honest, it's kind of hard to judge the portrayal when these characters are meant to be the bad guys. If they're not there, Doug and Tony don't have any obstacles in warning Tony's father about the attack. It turns out that Tony's father is the one who told the USS Enterprise not to return to Pearl Harbor when it was under attack. If it had sailed into the fray, it would have been hit by submarines trying to re-enter the harbour and might have blocked the channel. Doug and Tony arrive after assuring the latter's survival in the past. They help his father send a message to the Enterprise. His father realises Tony is his son from the future and dies knowing that his son will survive the horrors of the war to come. That is a pretty emotional scene as Tony finally gets closure on his father's death and knows that he died a hero. That's something I wanted to be more invested in because you get to learn about a character and their development based on the relationships they have with their family members. The office is destroyed just as Doug and Tony are leaving, answering the question as to why his father's body was never found. The coverage of the event is quite narrow. I don't think Pearl Harbor and being at Ground Zero on that fateful day is a story meant for a handful of main characters, but I'll elaborate on that towards the end of the video. I just don't think that the 60s were ready for a massive time travel show that featured such large-scale events. When early Doctor Who did stories set in the past, they tended to work with what little they had. Here, the devastation of battleships being sunk and aircraft blowing up their hangars seems like background noise. This is another film that uses the attack on Pearl Harbor for the inciting incident in a character's story. The difference is that this is a Japanese movie and the attack is told exclusively from the Japanese perspective. The cinematography is dependent on miniatures and matte paintings, given the film limitations of the time. I can't find any figures on what the budget was though, so if anyone knows about the history of Japanese cinema, please fill me in down in the comments. While the matte paintings are beautiful, they are very obviously painted and the miniatures look distinctly plastic. You don't see the Americans on the ground reacting to the carnage. The only human reactions we see are from the Japanese pilots. That I can partially understand because in some of the Western-made films we don't see the Japanese perspective either. To show a story in the shoes of someone who was there, they wouldn't have seen the full scale of events and would just be focused on fighting and surviving. From the air, however, you would see how the ships had blown up and maybe even people running for their lives. Unfortunately, I couldn't see the whole movie, but I managed to find some clips on YouTube. I welcome everyone to give it a watch if they can find it. It can be very limiting to just watch one event from one perspective. The film also covers the Battle of Midway, which I sometimes feel is like the sequel to Pearl Harbor, given that it turned the tide of the war against Japan and kind of proved Admiral Yamamoto right about that attacking America would yield no long-term benefits. Okay, my British pride may insult some Americans' pride in this section, but I don't think I could do any worse than Michael Bay. He is lucky. He is so lucky that he loves and cares for dogs. That's his one redeeming feature. That and his cheekbones. This movie has been lambasted by critics, audiences and historians for 20 years, and for good reason. It insults practically everyone in it, and even some who aren't. It insults the Royal Air Force, it insults people who actually died at Pearl Harbor, it insults Jennifer Garner, it needlessly insults the Japanese even though they are meant to be the bad guys, and it insults two brave airmen whose stories were appropriated by Ben Affleck and Josh Hartnett so that they could have their pointless plot-armoured romance. I'm never going to come back to this movie again. Not even if I cover the Battle of Britain, because the Battle of Britain took place between July and October 1940. Ben Affleck, I know this character has a name, but do you really care? Showing up as a volunteer for the Eagle Squadron in 1941 as an already serving member of the US Army would have created a diplomatic incident. You'd have to be an American civilian to join the RAF. Now, I'm not a Tory wanker who romanticises Britain's stiff upper lip attitude in World War II, catching Jerry with his trousers down, pip pip Bob's your uncle and God save the king and all that.
In English we say good morning.
I'm willing to criticise Winston Churchill for his treatment of non-white people in the British colonies when he was Prime Minister, but I kind of think that there is this one thing that's kind of sacred when it comes to World War II, and that is honouring the memories of the RAF fighters who fought and died to defend Britain from being conquered by Nazis. In Pearl Harbor, they're made to look as if they're just waiting for the United States to come and help them. I'm sure that narrative has been peddled around a lot on your side of the pond following the end of the war.
Oh, an English boy, eh? You know, we saved your ass in World War II.
Yeah, well, we saved your ass in World War III.
That's true.
Get off your high horse, put away your sermon, if it weren't for us, you'd be speaking German. And while we're here, there's one thing more. You still owe us money from the Second World War.
Hey, I'm not paying for your wine cellar, you thieving, would-be speaking German if it weren't for us, cheap little man.
That one pilot that Ben Affleck talks to must have had a serious concussion to say something so asinine.
God help anyone who goes to war with America.
Unless, of course, you're Vietnam. And one more thing. The RAF in World War II was not exclusively made up of Brits. No. A lot of pilots came from occupied territories who wanted to fight to liberate their countries, including Poland and Czechoslovakia. I know this is a tiny detail, but they should at least get a mention, because if the Justice League can remember it in half the runtime of this movie, a film that features the RAF as an important plot point should also do that.
So I think you'll find it's true.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Okay, rant over. What were we talking about? Oh yeah, Pearl Harbor. Do you guys remember when I reviewed Anne Boleyn 2021 and one of my first points was I should have known it was going to be bad because they didn't give it a title? Same situation here. I've come to realise that naming your thing after the topic is often, though not always, an indicator for the overall quality. So what should we call this movie? Well, it's about Pearl Harbor, so let's acknowledge the elephant-shaped iceberg in the room. This film was chasing a trend. That being big budget period piece romance that has to involve a lot of Americans in the cast to maximise bums on seats. This trend started with James Cameron's Titanic, but it didn't last long because the world fell swiftly out of love with disaster movies after September 2001. Pearl Harbor had the misfortune to come out only a few months before then. People went from "this movie is an insult to my past" to "oh god, I do not want to watch this movie after what I've been seeing on the news. I hear Buffy's doing a musical episode, let's watch that instead." The build-up to the attack is a bit meh on the American side. On the one hand, you get to meet these characters and form some sort of familiarity with them, which is what your first acts are for, but the only one I feel is a genuine character is Cuba Gooding Jr.'s performance as Dory Miller, and that is probably because he's playing someone who was actually there. And you get a feel of what it was like for African Americans serving in the army and navy to try and get some clout, because their positions were so limited. I wish this movie had been about him. # make a Dory Miller movie. I don't really care about Ben Affleck, or Josh Hartnett, or Kate Beckinsale, or their silly little love triangle. I don't care for Jon Voight's obvious rubber chin. Funnily enough, I was actually looking forward to the scenes with the Japanese characters because they were the ones moving the story along. They were Alfred Hitchcock's bomb under the table that was going to ignite the political powder keg that the United States and Japan were sitting on. Plus, Marco's performance as Admiral Yamamoto was really interesting, and it totally foreshadowed Uncle Iroh in Avatar: The Last Airbender.
It's almost twilight, Admiral. As your military consultant, I must advise you to halt your attack.
When the actual attack starts, Ben and Josh are asleep in their car near the beach, after some wild makeup sex, I have no doubt. Then they're basically driving around, narrowly avoiding gunfire and trying to get their hands on some aircraft so they can save the day. But it frequently cuts back to people on the battleships, especially the Arizona, Oklahoma and West Virginia. I do give this movie credit for at least including Dory Miller's contribution in defending the West Virginia, because it has thus far been the only version on this list to include it completely. There is the briefest glimpse of him in Tora Tora Tora, but that's about it. Even though the film is perfectly capable of showing the horrors and devastation of the attack, from torpedoes zipping through the water right under the feet of people who are already chucked overboard, to the terror of being trapped in an air pocket in a capsized ship with no way out, there are many elements of this which sort of cheapen all that effort. There is the sailor who literally comes on deck brushing his teeth and wearing a towel and proceeds to cower with his toothbrush instead of going inside for cover and putting some damn clothes on. There is the guy who literally has to pull 2 other guys out of cover and calling them cowards. The 2 incidents when a torpedo landing with a delayed detonation is used for comedic effect. The sailor on the Oklahoma that can't swim even though he is in the effing Navy. And of course the Japanese actively targeting and bombing the hospital. Why did that need to be included? Yes, I know it has Michael Bay's trademark sexy woman running from danger all sexy before she gets literally gunned down. And of course it will make General Hux all sad, but honestly, what do you expect when you get engaged in a disaster movie before the disaster actually happens? You might as well put a red shirt on. I'm guessing the decision was made so Kate Beckinsale could be put in danger and showed her being resourceful, but honestly it's enough that she and the other nurses are overwhelmed by all the casualties without them having to improvise shields from bombings. The real life hospital only had a few hundred beds, so them having patients in the corridor or lying on the kitchen counters sounds plausible. It already showed that they were complacent from lack of action. Apparently the bit about marking men on the forehead with lipstick to show which ones were going to die, which ones needed morphine and which ones needed amputation were actually true. I would praise them for it, but honestly, this film lost me at the whole bombing a hospital thing. Just because the thing sprinkles in some historically accurate elements, it doesn't distract from the largest inaccuracies. I think the main 3 characters just have too much plot armour in this story. They're so close to the gunfire, sometimes even having Japanese planes inches from their faces, and they don't even get grazed by a bullet, let alone shot. Josh Hartnett's plot armour will run out by the end of the film, but for now, all 3 need to survive to continue the melodrama. Since it wants to be Titanic so badly, and the love triangle wants to be Jack and Rose, I'm going to say right here and now that Jack and Rose did not have plot armour in Titanic. Plot armour is one of those things that's been used a lot in bad faith criticism, but Jack and Rose managed to survive the initial sinking of the Titanic by both working together and literally tearing the ship apart, keeping on their toes and trusting each other. It was only after the ship had sunk and only one of them could get on the board, or it would capsize with both of them on it, that Jack decided to sacrifice himself for her. In Pearl Harbor, I guess Ben Affleck's chin just absorbs the bullets. The 2 real-life pilots who Ben Affleck and Josh Hartnett's characters are based on are George Welch and Kenneth M. Taylor. Welch and Taylor, likewise, weren't actually in Pearl Harbor when the attack started, but they managed to get 2 planes ready for takeoff on the north shore of Oahu. Taylor accidentally flew into the middle of a Japanese formation and was nearly shot in the head, but survived. Welch had his friend's back and managed to save him by crashing a Japanese plane that was gaining on Taylor. Again, why couldn't the movie be about them? We don't need a love triangle. We could have just had 2 friends trying to survive Pearl Harbor. Say what you like about James Cameron's Titanic, but you can tell that that movie was a labour of love, done by someone who genuinely cared about the source material and is even today still studying it, not putting together another firework display to cash in on the 60th anniversary of the disaster. Eventually you just get bored of all the explosions.
Those aren't ideas, those are special effects!
That's it for this movie, and I will not talk about it again after this video because it is irrelevant to anything else I plan to cover on this channel. This series is one of the most depressing things I've ever seen. Not that that's a bad thing. I mean, we're looking at the early years of the Second World War on European soil and all the atrocities that entailed. I just have a visceral reaction to certain events during World War II. Granted, everyone should have a visceral reaction to certain events in World War II. Again, I hesitate to actually say it because of YouTube being silly. Because if they don't demonetize, they will no doubt just bury me under the algorithm. But this is still an amazing series. The Winds of War takes place between the summer of 1939 and December 1941. It focuses primarily on the Henry family, specifically Victor Henry and Byron Henry, as they see the events of the war unfold as neutral observers before their country is dragged into it. Victor Henry in particular is practically the Forrest Gump of the series, as he meets several famous figures from the war, including Hitler, Stalin, FDR and Churchill. I was surprised to see a series of this scale come out in the early 80s. They use really good practical effects that are on par with Lucasfilm, and you can tell certain scenes in Russia and London were filmed on location. This was back when home media was becoming more affordable for consumers and profitable for producers, thanks to VHS and Betamax.
What's Betamax? What's VHS?
I know we take this for granted because we can catch up on missed programmes or have the whole series at our disposal right away these days. But back then it used to be, if you missed an episode of a show, that was it. You'd be lucky if you could find it on a rerun. But with VHS you can watch a show again and again. This was a phenomenon in the early 80s, and home media sales would allow a studio to earn back their budget. Winds of War and its sequel series were among the most expensive television dramas made in their time. Even though there are only 7 episodes of this series, some are almost as long as The Shawshank Redemption. And given their content, it was just not an option to binge this series, hence why the script was heavily delayed. It has taken a lot of Tomb Raider and Buffy and Muppets and musicals and Lin-Manuel Miranda to boost morale between viewings. The attack on Pearl Harbor is more of an unceremonious climax to the series and kind of underwhelming. Of all the named characters we have in this series, literally none of them are at ground zero when the attack begins. You have Warren Henry, who is the oldest son of the family, serving as a pilot on the Enterprise, who gets shot down within the first hour of the attack, but he survives and somehow manages to get to a plane on Ford Island and survive. His wife is the audience surrogate for the start of the attack, going to fetch groceries from a Japanese vendor just as the planes sweep over the island. I like that this brief scene shows how quickly someone can turn to prejudice given the glare she gives the vendor when she realises that the planes are Japanese and the attack that people have dreaded for months is happening. Paranoia that Japanese citizens in Hawaii helped execute the attack is what led to their internment. Even though Victor Henry is our main character, he's not actually at Pearl Harbor either. He's en route about to take command of the California, which we know was one of the battleships that sank. And even Byron Henry, who was the closest thing to the second main character that we have, is in the Philippines. I thought the tension was going to escalate when Warren went to Ford Island to find a plane because there was still 40 minutes left in the runtime, but as soon as his boat pulled away, leaving his wife on the pier, we get Franklin Roosevelt's speech to Congress, and I was like, wait, it's over already? Granted, I was watching this solely for the attack on Pearl Harbor, so I had the full context, but I think I took a long walk for a short drink of water. One of the largest disasters in American history deserves a good chunk of screen time. One of the main motifs throughout is these American characters feeling helpless at seeing these terrible things happening in Europe. But they all have a safe and comfortable home back in America. In some way, they are detached because America itself thought it was detached from international politics, until the Japanese proved them otherwise. To clarify, it isn't just movies and TV that we're going to be showing on this channel to qualify in rankings videos, because believe it or not, video games are a legit form of media too, so they will also be featuring. I say this now because this is the first video game to have the honour of being featured on this channel, apart from of course my Tomb Raider timeline video. Just to be clear, I'm not the one playing this game. This is from a video on YouTube that I'll post the link to. You're playing a pilot who wakes up on the morning of the attack. You get to choose your own name in this, so I'll just summarise what happens in second person. When you take off, your first objective is to shoot down a number of Japanese aircraft. The aerial view of Pearl Harbor, especially for a game that came out in 2007, has aged okay, I must say, but I do see why Tomb Raider used to always restrict you with the high walls to keep the details. You see battleships that are moored at Ford Island going up in smoke. It's like getting a guided tour of the base as the attack plays out and you get some control in what happens as you frantically try to stay alive and shoot down as many planes as possible. Of course, it is quite short, hence its placement on this list, but I have a few nitpicks as well. One objective is to stop the enemy from targeting the fuel tanks. It's not as egregious as having them target the hospital, as the goal was clearly to target the Navy and Army and not to actively harm civilians, but the fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor were never an objective to this first and second waves. The tanks were intended to be targeted by the planned third wave that ultimately didn't take off because it was believed by the senior officers that they didn't have the element of surprise anymore. You also have to defend the USS Arizona, although the Arizona was hit quite early on and its multiple explosions is what made it the battleship with the highest casualties, so there won't be much left to defend at this rate. I think there were just some limitations as to what you can do as opposed to just shoot down some planes, but it is over very, very quickly. I imagine if you're a first time player it probably does take a lot longer as you get shot down multiple times, but this particular gameplay just takes 10 minutes. This game is a first-person shooter as a seaman aboard the USS California. With him, you're thrown into the chaos of the attack and you have to make your way up to the deck in order to fight back. It kind of reminds me of Tomb Raider Underworld, where likewise you're also thrown into the chaos at the start of the game. Rather than a quiet tutorial level that holds your hand, you have to stay on your toes and it's very easy to die in less than 5 minutes and have to start a new game. You make your way onto the deck, helping people along the way and putting out fires. It is a little Hollywood to portray fire extinguishers as able to put out a large fire. That's just a little pet peeve I've gained from going through fire safety training for work twice, because extinguishers are there just to clear a path so people can escape. Tangent over. On the deck you mount a gun and try to shoot the torpedoes out of the water before they hit the ship. This does take a while and requires good reactions, so I wouldn't recommend this game if it's your first time using a first-person shooter. Also, because it's a video game, I won't question the water physics, because if you can't be shot from the surface when you're submerged in the water, it gives you too much of a shield. The mission ends with you being chucked overboard by an explosion and picked up by a passing boat. I can't much account for the quality of the rest of the game, but historically it works pretty well, as you get a feel as to what it's like to be a normal guy thrown into the deep end, which is what the experience was like for a lot of people. Once again, the attack on Pearl Harbor is the inciting incident for the rest of the movie, but unlike In Harm's Way, we actually get to see the attack scale. I'm not really a fan of Roland Emmerich movies. Come Pride Month, I'm going to tear Stonewall to pieces, but Midway is surprisingly good. Emmerich is usually contemptuous when it comes to historical accuracy, but I think showing the attack from the perspective of people aboard the battleship that was damaged the most was the right way to go for Emmerich's trademark blowing up of historical landmarks. Other perspectives of the attack include Aaron Eckhart and Nick Jonas, who are pilots on the Enterprise, the latter of whom loses one of his friends in the attack. Mandy Moore is the wife of an officer who sees the attack happening from afar, and then there's Patrick Wilson, who predicted that the attack would happen but no one listened. But the height of the attack focuses on two guys on the Arizona. One is a seaman who resents having to set out seats for church services because he's an atheist. His superior winds him up about it, and this brief glimpse of humanity between them gives them enough depth for the audience to care when the attack happens. The dialogue has all the cheese we've come to expect from Roland Emmerich movies, and you just know that when two guys who are serving in any force, whether it's the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, the Marines, the police even, if they're having a laugh before a giant event happens, there is a 50 to 100% chance that both are going to die. When the attack starts, the officer takes charge and keeps his head, showing that he earned his rank and ultimately dies shooting down planes, while the sailor narrowly manages to get to the Vestal. This doesn't last very long, but the full scale of the attack is shown and you get a feel of the devastation. I do like how the destruction keeps escalating for them, showing the ship catching fire and the flames in the water caused by the oil leakage getting more out of control, making it a clear matter of urgency to get off of that ship as quickly as possible. The CGI isn't that great, but I think I'll let it slide just this once, because the budget was a lot lower than your average Roland Emmerich movie. You know that your movie is meant to be a propaganda piece when you literally put Uncle Sam in it. I found this movie on YouTube, it's freely available to watch, and all of a sudden I was just like, what the bloody hell is Abraham Lincoln doing in here? Because I thought it was Abraham Lincoln, turns out it's Uncle Sam. And just to confirm it's Uncle Sam, after he's been walking around with his arms crossed for about 10 minutes, his jacket opens and you see the Star-Spangled Banner on his waistcoat. I thought I'd just put a version that was made with the intention of being war propaganda this high on the list, so we can witness what was going through America's mind at the time as a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor. This isn't exactly a movie, as more of a summary of what life was like in Hawaii before the attack, and then what happened afterwards, although from an incredibly biased lens. This includes the large population of Japanese immigrants in Hawaii at the time, and what starts as a rather simple explanation of how they integrated into society suddenly becomes incredibly ominous as they show a montage of Japanese-owned businesses as if they are some sort of plague. Basically, it's racist. It's very, very racist. I understand it's excusable to villainise the people who were actually behind the attack, but the actual civilians who were just as surprised by the attack as the Americans didn't deserve to be misrepresented. Keep in mind, when this movie was made and released, several thousand Japanese people were being held against their will in internment camps. And here we have Uncle Sam being like, I'm not racist, but I love that the guy he's talking to wonders what it would be like if Americans worshipped George Washington as a god. Newsflash, some of them do. It endeavours to show the Japanese as some sort of threat bubbling under the surface, not because of attempts on Japan's part to expand their territories and stop America from dominating and colonising them, but because they have schools that teach Japanese. How dare they learn the culture of their homeland? This segment was removed from the original picture. The attack begins with Uncle Sam literally having slept in and assured through pride and complacency that America is safe and shouldn't need to worry about an attack. The film also got censored for showing not taking the sighting from Private Lockhart seriously, as it made America look bad, and America's not allowed to look bad. Referring to the Japanese attackers as locusts, the narrator refers to them coming in wave after wave, even though there were only 2 waves. There were different formations in the wave, but that does not count as a wave. The attack is achieved by using some stock footage, although you can tell when it's being reused, as well as matte paintings, miniatures, and having extras run around in smoky sets while pretending to fire guns in the air. The Americans are shown to be surprised by the attack, but keeping their heads and jumping into action as quickly as they can and being resourceful. Watch this guy on the Arizona casually pushing his shirt on while the ship blows up. The dying scenes are very melodramatic. Whoops, I've been shot, time to lie down now. I thought I saw Dory Miller for a moment because you see a black guy on the machine guns, but this guy ends up getting killed, so I'm going to guess that wasn't him. The use of miniatures is fine for what it is, although a lot of it does clearly stand out as fake. It's just something that happens with miniatures, scale models and stuff. Like sometimes, especially when you're watching this on very high quality computers like what I've got right now, you know, it's like, oh, that's very clearly fake. The ending narration, however, that's where you know someone's trying to push a narrative. They said that the Japanese were beaten off, not in that way, and forced to turn back because the retaliation was too great. It is true that during the second wave the anti-aircraft retaliation was better because troops and seamen had reached their battle stations and knew that something was still coming. But the aftermath, where it shows the Japanese reaction to the attack, is a bit... like, it is so stereotypically trying to present a thick Asian accent, but the broadcaster just sounds like a Dalek.
His Excellency Premier General Hideki Tojo will report to the nation.
I also don't know why Doctor Who keeps coming up in this video.
Mommy. Mommy.
And yeah, it is so weird to see Nagasaki on that map before it would become famous for a whole other reason. On the American side, they show the charming montage of the salvage and repair works that took place, showing Americans can get through the toughest of disasters and set out to beat back Japan for the damage that they've done. Showing the Japanese having to paint out the characters on their business signs and boarding up their Shinto temples doesn't feel triumphant in hindsight. It's sad because you would get considered a traitor for your heritage. This isn't patriotism, this is cultural oppression. I had to take this movie with a pinch of salt because it was intended to be very biased and used as a morale booster for recruitment. You know, this would be something that Steve Rogers, before he became Captain America, would go and see in the movies. I still find the scene with the two ghosts, one from Pearl Harbor and one from the First World War, walking through a cemetery, really interesting. The claim that the cemetery is full of casualties from the Revolution and 1812 and the Civil War, and how they'll have to make room for more casualties, is poignant. Although that quote where he says, "We'll save any country that wants to be a democracy," or any other book of rules, has just not aged well in the past 80 years. I put this so high because it technically counts as a secondary source of America as it faced the Second World War. Is it accurate about the events? Not entirely, but given the reaction America had to Pearl Harbor, this shows how the reaction was used and how prejudice against the Japanese easily turned to viewing everyone around you as an enemy. Also, you will never see America film a communist Russian flag with such bombastic music ever again. Next time it will be the Imperial March. And for goodness sake, stop filming the Union Jack and calling it England. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland weren't exactly neutral states. This is, no doubt, the perfect movie. It is not as widely remembered today because it critically and commercially bombed in America when it came out. I want to say it had the bad luck to come out during the Vietnam War, but that was me thinking that Vietnam wasn't a 20-year-long conflict. Sorry, I don't know American history as well as I do with British and European history, though I can name all the presidents. The movie was made by two separate crews. You have the American crew featuring the political build-up. They have analysts trying to guess when the attack will happen, the failed peace negotiations, higher-ups dismissing the idea that an attack will happen. There are personnel driving around Washington DC at late hours trying to pass news between departments. I think this is the best version of Yamamoto we'll ever see. I love the kind of character study on a highly moralistic person who is bound by honour to their emperor and country to oversee an attack that will drag this country into a war with a power that could wipe them out if done wrong. This kind of character does fascinate me a lot, which is why I'm so obsessed with Star Wars, but that is not for here. I can understand why Americans did not like the film at the time. Not only was Vietnam still going on, so watching their troops getting gunned down wasn't good for morale, but the movie ends with a pessimistic tone. There is no America will get through this kind of message, only dread for what's going to happen next. America, as a result, looks kind of helpless. In Japan, the movie was a success, however. Recently it's gained a resurgence due partly toward hatred of the Michael Bay movie and as an example of portraying two sides of a conflict and a movie with really good practical effects. If there is one thing you can say about the portrayal of the attack, it's that the practical effects are just chef's kiss. I think this is the sort of thing people like to present as an example as to why practical can be better than CGI. And yes, it is more satisfying to see an explosion actually happen on screen and have the extras running from it. In some cases they actually were, because some of the props got way out of control. The problem with having CGI explosions is that you have the freedom to make as many as you like, to the point it starts to look like overkill. With practical effects, the explosions can be made just as impactful if you film them properly. One of the biggest criticisms that came from American audiences was how it showed the Navy and Army as ill-prepared and disorganised. The truth was, a lot of them were. Have you ever woken up on a Sunday morning by something as devastating as your cat jumping on your chest? Well, imagine that cat is a torpedo. If we were in that situation as ordinary people who have never had to do a single ounce of combat in our lives, we would panic and we would run for cover. However, the Army and Navy personnel were put through rigorous training so they could keep their heads in a crisis, as well as war games and manoeuvres so that if an attack happened, they would know what to do. With no preparation, there would indeed have been a few moments of panic, but it wouldn't have lasted long. I would say that this film doesn't endeavour to present a message to viewers and just wanted to be an honest retelling of events from both sides of the conflict. I would also say that no one is intentionally vilified, although I think we can all agree that launching a surprise attack on a nation that is supposed to be at peace is kind of rude, if not a war crime. This almost skirts the edge of being a documentary because it's so accurate and objectively shows the events, but as long as we don't have narration and constant intervals of historians and scientists being interviewed to explain the context, it still counts as a movie, so that's why it earns the #1 spot on this list. It's easy to determine the defining point of a historical figure when they have a lot of on-screen counterparts. For people like Anne Boleyn, Mary Queen of Scots and Marie Antoinette, that is their execution. For others, such as Churchill, FDR or Martin Luther King Jr., it is their well-known speeches. Finding one for a significant event can also be a challenge. When we get to famous battles like Waterloo and Hastings, you can usually point to the moment when the tide of battle turns towards the ultimate victors. For large disasters, I'm going to say it's the beginning of that disaster that defines it. The moment things turn from calm to chaos. So for Pearl Harbor on screen, this can range from spotting or hearing the Japanese planes from the ground, or the first bomb dropping. That is the moment that the characters have lost control, Japanese and American. At that moment, nothing will ever be the same again. There is no going back from this. When it is shown towards the end of the story, like From Here to Eternity or The Winds of War, it can be a matter of thinking, oh, what else can go wrong? Or the idea that these characters were so close to fulfilling their main goals in their character arcs and getting what they want, but the forces of the outside world intervene. Having the attack at the beginning seems to always be used as an inciting incident. This is where perhaps an American officer disgraced themselves or has survivor's guilt for what happened and seeks to redeem themselves for the following events of the movie. I can understand using such an event for historical fiction because they, like the United States, were called to action by it. However, the downside is seeing only a limited view of events unfolding and the full scale can sometimes go undersold. Pearl Harbor, The Time Tunnel and Tora 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 are unique from the other two categories, as their plots are distinctly centred around the attack. As such, we have to dedicate just as much screen time to building up to the event as we do when it unfolds. I credit Pearl Harbor for showing the Japanese preparing for the attack and giving them a face. It also adds a ticking clock to the Americans, like, guys, something really serious is happening here and we're wondering why someone who is so obviously Bostonian like Ben Affleck is trying to do a Tennessee accent.
I said, pass me that beer, would you?
The beer.
Pass me the beer.
The beer.
No, not the beer. The beer. Lager beer, lager.
Lager beer.
Lager beer.
Oh, lager beer. Here you go, a lager beer.
In the time tunnel, we know what's going to happen. The tension is that is Tony going to warn his father in time? Though I think they could have added the sound of the planes approaching while Tony is talking to his younger self, just to amp up the urgency. Of course, Tora 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 does this best. The moment Fushida says those words, we have crossed the line and nothing will stop what is to come. It can be a bit comedic on the American side, where the two officers think a plane is a rogue pilot flying without authorization until it drops a bomb, and then the Nevada is playing the national anthem as the planes swoop in. I can't imagine anything more quintessentially American than waiting to finish the Star-Spangled Banner before assuming general quarters, even if they have to do it at an accelerated tempo. They also made sure to show the build-up more extensively than in the 2001 film, as all the characters in this film are meant to be people who are actually there, along with people getting more and more anxious to warn people who don't take the matter seriously. Everyone loves it when the tension finally snaps. We see it in film and TV and theatre and video games all the time. When the silence finally shatters, when the alien bursts out of John Hurt's chest, when Joffrey says, "Bring me his head," when Caesar says, "Et tu, Brute," when the first sirens start blaring in Silent Hill. That is what makes a moment so powerful, and the beginning of the attack on Pearl Harbor is no different. After seeing all of these recreations and the stories surrounding them, disregarding the quality of special effects that would have been possible in the time they were made, I have come to realise that these large-scale events are best portrayed by a cast of thousands. This is a phrase you give a movie that shows the scale of the epic. It might take place in multiple locations with characters in different places to be the audience surrogate. Meanwhile, you have a lot of extras and minor characters spread out to show the number of people affected. This is Roland Emmerich's formula for most of his disaster movies. Other examples include Ben-Hur, All Things Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. Pearl Harbor, like most famous historical events, are best portrayed in what is known as a plot-driven narrative. This is where events escalate as a result of actions outside the character's control, as opposed to character-driven narratives where the few main characters' decisions and their consequences determine the outcome. I'd say Tora 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 is half and half, as the narrative is character-driven on the Japanese side of things, while the American side is plot-driven. Showing these characters trying to survive bombs and gunfire gives a feel of just how vulnerable and small they are compared with the rest of the world. Nonetheless, the sheer human determination to live will oppose wars and devastation every time. It doesn't matter what our enemies throw at us.
Indomitable, that's the word. Indomitable!
A cast of thousands can really help show just how human these events are. These events still affect us today. A lot of us in the West have never had to worry about standing on a beach in France, hoping that there will be a ship to take you home that won't get hit by a U-boat. We may never be stranded on a sinking ship in the middle of the Atlantic, or fighting for a king whose name we can't remember because we're illiterate serfs. But creating these epics with such large casts can put us on the same level as those who did live through these events and empathise with people who are long dead. And when these hundreds, if not thousands of extras are actually there, even if you can only pay them £1 for showing up like Edgar Wright did in Shaun of the Dead, it is so worth it to see the frame packed to the brim with them. It just is not the same with CGI extras. As we wrap up our coverage of Pearl Harbor, I'm looking forward to what other events we might cover in the future. I'm gunning for Titanic in April because it will be the 110th anniversary of the sinking. And when you talk about history on your channel, of course James Cameron's movie is going to show up sooner or later. Overall, I think the makings of an epic on the level of Tora 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 may be on the cards in the future. It might not be about Pearl Harbor. Maybe it will be set in a galaxy far, far away. I can only hope that this event in particular will still be respectfully remembered, despite some of its lesser on-screen counterparts. Now it's time for captions. Sorry I'm not sitting in front of the camera this time. The reason being is because I've got a cold sore, just cannot be bothered to gussy up and sit before a camera today, so I'm gonna do this behind my microphone, hiding behind the captions. Anyway, yes, caption time. This is what we do at the end of every rankings video. I find a frame while I'm editing, I get you guys to make jokes about it a few days before I'm finished making the video, and then you make some jokes. We all have some laughs at the end of the video. Sometimes we need it depending on how depressing the subject matter it is. And today it is The Time Tunnel, the short-lived sci-fi series from 20th Century Fox. You know what's weird? The Time Tunnel is owned by 20th Century Fox. Why is this series not on Disney+? Is it on American Disney+? Please let me know. Me when I got lost from my skiing trip with school. Your car? No, we haven't seen your car. We certainly haven't seen it in a ditch and on fire. Where was the last place you left it? Oh, we're so dead. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's time for you to get a pair of glasses, Doug. Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. This one just says, Time Tunnel! Or is it Time Tunnel? Did you just see that? Yes, I did. I think Batman just revealed his identity. Mom, I did wash my hands. It's very important to wash your hands, people. When your parents ask what you've been doing with your life. Well, Tony's parents won't be asking him that, but I'm sure Doug's do. I'm not sure about Doug's parents in the series. Well, actually, I think that dress looks great on you. Doug and Tony watching Euphoria. I haven't seen Euphoria, so I will take your word for it. My friends and I watching a Lifetime movie we've been forced to watch during health class. See, we didn't get to watch Lifetime movies. We had the deputy head of the lower school, because we had a lower school campus and upper school campus. We had the deputy head of the lower school sitting us all in the cafeteria and yelling at us that sex hurts. Catholic education would recommend. New wall decoration, upside down chair, very popular in Europe. When you have more guests than seats, pop an extra guest upside down in a chair nailed to the wall. It's not comfortable, but it is amusing. I swear I once caught a fish this big. And before I forget, the Patreon thank yous. Yes, if you want to support the channel, please consider becoming a patron. There are several rewards you can get from joining. One of them, getting a shout out right now. So thank you to my King and Queen patrons, Anastasia Gracia, Larissa and Alison Cuff. Thank you guys so much. And there's also another special shout out I must give to Autumn Rain, whose name accidentally got left off the credits in the last video. So if you're a patron, your name will automatically go in the credits no matter what tier you are. But if I forget to put your name in, then you'll get a shout out in the next video as an apology. And if you like the video, please be sure to like, share and subscribe, because that really does help boost it up the algorithm ladder. And I hope you guys look after yourselves. Please make sure that you're staying safe and looking after your health, both physical and mental. I think the next video will probably be the Catherine Parr history video. Catherine Howard Part 3 has still got a long ways to go. Following that, I'm going to be working solely on the Titanic videos that are going to be coming out in April. Until then, see you next time.